the summer of 1878, when typhoid fever claimed the lives of 47 residents in Harper County, Kansas, four brothers named Blackwood displayed an immunity that defied medical explanation. But their survival came at a cost so grotesque that 3 different physicians refused to document their findings, and the Kansas State Medical Board quietly sealed all records related to the case. What started as divine protection became something far more sinister, a transformation so disturbing that the local Methodist Church burned every mention of the Blackwood family from their records. The brothers developed symptoms that no medical textbook had ever described, symptoms that grew progressively more inhuman with each passing day. By winter, neighbors reported that the brothers no longer cast proper shadows. Their voices had taken on harmonic qualities that made listeners' ears bleed, and their eyes reflected light like those of nocturnal predators. The final medical report, classified to this day, allegedly contained the phrase, "Subjects have transcended human biological classification," before all documentation was permanently sealed. Tonight, after nearly 150 years of silence, we're about to uncover why modern science still refuses to acknowledge what happened on that isolated farm, and why the truth about the Blackwood brothers might be more terrifying than any supernatural explanation. Before we continue with the story of Ezra, Caleb, Josiah, and Abel Blackwood, I need to ask you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the mysteries that others fear to tell. If you're one of those true mystery seekers, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. Are you brave enough to learn what really happened when faith and science collided on the Kansas prairie? Now let's step back into 1878, where faith and fear walked hand in hand. The small farming community of Cedar Ridge, Kansas, existed as little more than a crossroads between wheat fields and cattle ranches in the late 1870s. With barely 300 souls scattered across the windswept prairie, it was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's business, where a man's word was his bond, and where Sunday worship at the Methodist Church served as both spiritual guidance and social gathering. The harsh winters that brought blizzards capable of burying entire homesteads, and the scorching summers that could kill crops in a single week, had forged a population of stoic, God-fearing people who viewed hardship as divine testing and prosperity as heavenly blessing. The landscape itself seemed to encourage such thinking. Miles of golden wheat stretched to every horizon, broken only by the occasional farmhouse, windmill, or grove of cottonwood trees marking a creek bed. The sky dominated everything, vast, endless, and ever-changing. During thunderstorms, lightning would dance across the prairie for hours, illuminating the grassland in brief, brilliant flashes that revealed the true isolation of each homestead. In winter, the wind howled across the flatland with a voice that sounded almost human, carrying snow and cold that could freeze a man to death in minutes if he lost his way between barn and house. The Blackwood brothers had arrived in Cedar Ridge in the spring of 1872, purchasing 640 acres of prime prairie land with money inherited from their father's farm back in Clinton County, Ohio. The brothers had sold everything they owned, loaded their belongings into 2 covered wagons, and made the journey west with the determination of men following a divine calling. Ezra Blackwood, the eldest at 36 when they arrived, possessed the natural authority of a man accustomed to leadership and responsibility. Standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders built by years of farm work, he carried himself with quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding it. His weathered hands, scarred by countless hours of labor, could gentle a spooked horse or guide a plow with equal skill. But it was his eyes that people remembered most, pale blue like winter ice. They seemed to look right through a person to something deeper. Those who spoke with Ezra often came away feeling that he had seen straight into their soul and found them wanting. Caleb, 2 years younger than Ezra, served as the family's practical mind and business manager. Where Ezra led through moral authority, Caleb managed through careful planning and mathematical precision. He could calculate grain yields, livestock prices, and weather patterns with an accuracy that impressed even the most experienced farmers in the county. His ledger books, kept in meticulous handwriting, tracked every penny earned and spent, every bushel harvested, every head of cattle bought or sold. But beneath his practical exterior burned the same intense faith that motivated all the brothers. Caleb saw God's hand in everything, in the perfect geometry of a wheat field, in the precise timing of rainfall, in the mathematical harmony that governed the natural world. Josiah, the third brother at 31, had received the most formal education of the four. He had attended Ohio Wesleyan University for 2 years before their father's death called him back to the family farm. During those years, he had studied not only theology, but also medicine, philosophy, and natural sciences. His personal library, carefully transported to Kansas in a specially built crate, contained over 200 volumes covering subjects from biblical commentary to human anatomy. Josiah's room in the farmhouse resembled a scholar's study more than a farmer's quarters, with books stacked on every available surface and papers covered with his careful notes filling wooden boxes beneath his bed. Abel, the youngest at 25, burned with religious fervor that sometimes concerned even his faith-driven siblings. Where the older brothers approached their devotion with scholarly depth or practical application, Abel's faith was pure emotion and absolute surrender. He spent hours each day in prayer, often weeping with the intensity of his communion with the divine. He fasted regularly, sometimes going days without food, while claiming that prayer and scripture provided all the sustenance he needed. His fellow church members back in Ohio had called him touched by the Spirit, but some had whispered that his devotion bordered on dangerous obsession. Unlike their neighbors who attended the Methodist church in town, a modest white-painted building with a bell tower that could be heard for miles across the prairie, the Blackwood brothers had constructed their own chapel on a hill overlooking their property. The building project had taken them the better part of their first year in Kansas. They had quarried limestone from a creek bed on their land, cut oak timber from a grove near the property line, and crafted every piece of the structure with their own hands. The chapel they built reflected their austere but deeply felt faith. The structure measured 30 feet by 20 feet, with walls of precisely fitted limestone and a roof of hand-split oak shingles. Inside, they had carved pews from local walnut wood, each one perfectly smooth and fitted with careful joinery that spoke of hours of patient craftsmanship. The altar, also hand-carved, bore inscriptions in Hebrew that Josiah had copied from his biblical texts. Tall windows on the east and west walls caught the morning and evening sun, filling the space with golden light during their dawn and dusk prayers. The brothers held their own services every Sunday morning and evening, following what they called primitive Methodist principles, a stricter interpretation of Wesley's teachings that emphasized personal revelation, direct communion with the divine, and the priesthood of all believers. Their services included longer periods of silent prayer, extensive biblical study, and what they called testimony of the Spirit, where each brother would share any divine revelations or insights he had received during the week. Their daily routine reflected their commitment to both faith and labor. They rose each morning at 4 o'clock for an hour of silent prayer in the chapel, watching the sun rise over the eastern prairie while they communed individually with God. After a simple breakfast of bread, milk, and whatever fruit was in season, they would spend the morning working their fields. The afternoon hours were devoted to animal care, equipment maintenance, and the countless tasks required to keep a farm operational. But evening was always reserved for spiritual pursuits, Bible study, theological discussion, and group prayer that often lasted until well after midnight. The brothers lived as bachelors, dedicating themselves entirely to their faith and their land, though this decision had not been without cost. Their farmhouse, a sturdy 2-story structure they had built during their second year in Kansas, reflected their utilitarian approach to life and their deep religious commitment. The walls displayed biblical verses carved into wooden plaques, each one selected for its relevance to daily farm life and spiritual growth. Every room contained at least one well-worn Bible, and several had additional religious texts that Josiah had determined were worthy of regular study. By the summer of 1878, the Blackwood farm had become a model of agricultural success and spiritual dedication. Their wheat fields stretched golden across the prairie. Their cattle grazed contentedly on healthy grassland. Their silo bulged with grain, and their chapel stood as a testament to their unwavering faith. The brothers had achieved everything they had hoped for when they left Ohio 6 years earlier: prosperity, independence, and the freedom to worship according to their deepest convictions. Their neighbors in Cedar Ridge respected the Blackwood brothers, though many found their intensity unsettling and their isolation from community life puzzling. The brothers were known for their honesty in business dealings, their willingness to help neighbors in times of crisis, and their reputation for hard work and fair treatment of the occasional hired hands they employed during harvest season. But they were also known for their unwillingness to participate in social gatherings, their refusal to engage in casual conversations, and their habit of evaluating everyone they met with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. When the brothers came to town for supplies, which they did every 2 weeks with military precision, they moved with quiet purpose and spoke only when necessary. They would arrive at the general store with a carefully prepared list, conduct their business with polite efficiency, and depart without engaging in the social pleasantries that other farmers enjoyed. Children often stared in fascination at the 4 identical beards, perfectly trimmed and coal-black, that gave the brothers an almost biblical appearance. The first case of typhoid fever appeared in Cedar Ridge on July 15, 1878, striking with the sudden violence that characterized the most virulent strains of the disease. Mrs. Sarah Hartman, who ran the general store with her husband Benjamin, had seemed perfectly healthy when she opened the store that morning, greeting customers with her usual cheerful demeanor and discussing the promising prospects for the wheat harvest. But by afternoon she was burning with fever, her skin covered with the characteristic rose-colored spots that experienced physicians recognized as the mark of typhoid. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the county's only physician, had been summoned from his rounds at the Henderson farm, where he had been delivering a breech birth that had taken most of the day. He arrived at the Hartman store to find Sarah delirious with fever, her temperature so high that it barely registered on his clinical thermometer. Her husband Benjamin, a normally calm and practical man, was pacing the store like a caged animal, wringing his hands and begging Dr. Morrison to do something, anything, to save his wife of 23 years. "Doc, she was fine this morning," Benjamin kept repeating, his voice cracking with desperation. "Fine as she's ever been. Served breakfast to the Henderson boys when they came for supplies, laughed at something young Tommy said about his new foal. How does a person go from healthy to this in the space of a few hours?" Dr. Morrison had seen typhoid before during his medical training in Philadelphia, but nothing quite like this. The disease typically developed over days or weeks, giving physicians time to attempt treatment and families time to prepare for the likely outcome. But Sarah Hartman's case seemed to have compressed the entire progression of the disease into a single devastating day. Her fever was higher than he had ever recorded in a living patient. Her delirium was complete and violent, and the rose-colored spots covered not just her chest, but her entire body, in patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their symmetry. Despite Dr. Morrison's best efforts, cold compresses, laudanum for the pain, and careful monitoring of her vital signs, Sarah Hartman died just after midnight on July 16th. But even in death, her case remained deeply troubling. The rigidity of her body set in far too quickly. Her skin took on a waxy pallor that suggested preservation rather than normal decomposition, and her eyes, which Dr. Morrison had closed according to proper procedure, kept opening again no matter how many times he pressed the lids shut. Within 24 hours of Sarah's death, 3 more cases appeared in Cedar Ridge. The victims seemed to have nothing in common except their use of water from the town's main well. a source that had provided clean, sweet water for the community since its founding. But when Dr. Morrison examined the well, he found evidence of contamination from runoff that had somehow breached the carefully constructed stone lining. The second victim was old Heinrich Zimmermann, a German immigrant who had farmed the same section of land for 15 years. Heinrich's case followed the same devastating pattern as Sarah's: perfect health in the morning, raging fever by afternoon, and death before dawn. But Heinrich's final hours were marked by something that Dr. Morrison had never encountered. The old farmer spoke in languages that no one in the community recognized, using words and phrases that sounded ancient and somehow threatening. The third and fourth victims were the Patterson twins, Emma and Ellen, two 16-year-old girls who had been among the most promising students in the county's single schoolhouse. Their deaths were particularly heartbreaking because they occurred simultaneously, as if the disease had coordinated its attack to claim both girls at exactly the same moment. Their father, James Patterson, later told Dr. Morrison that in their final delirium, the twins had spoken in perfect unison, reciting what sounded like prayers in a language that resembled Latin, but contained sounds that human throats should not have been able to produce. By August 1st, 14 people had died from the strange typhoid strain, and Dr. Morrison had documented symptoms and progressions that defied every principle of medical science he had learned. The victims all died within 24 hours of showing symptoms. Their fevers reached temperatures that should have killed them within minutes, and their final hours were marked by delirium that seemed more like possession than medical crisis. The fear that gripped Cedar Ridge during those terrible weeks in late July and early August was unlike anything the community had ever experienced. Families barricaded themselves in their homes, refusing to venture out except for the most essential tasks. The general store, now run by Benjamin Hartman with the help of his brother-in-law, became a place of whispered conversations and furtive glances. The Methodist Church, which had always served as the community's gathering place and source of comfort, stood nearly empty during Sunday services, as people feared that any congregation might provide the disease with new victims. Dr. Morrison had ordered the contaminated well sealed and advised all residents to boil their water. But the disease continued to spread with a pattern that suggested something more than simple contamination. The victims seemed to be chosen according to some logic that had nothing to do with their exposure to the well water or their proximity to previous cases. Some families lost every member, while neighboring households remained completely healthy. It was against this backdrop of terror and confusion that the Blackwood brothers made their fateful decision to involve themselves in the crisis. The brothers had remained isolated on their farm during the early weeks of the epidemic, following their usual practice of avoiding unnecessary contact with the town and its residents. But on August 10th, Josiah announced to his brothers that he had received what he believed was a divine revelation calling them to action. "I have prayed for guidance," Josiah told his brothers as they gathered for their evening meal. "And the Lord has shown me that this pestilence is a test not just of the community's faith, but of our own worthiness to serve as his instruments. We have been preserved from the disease not for our own safety, but so that we might demonstrate the power of true faith in the face of ultimate trial." The decision once made was implemented with the same methodical precision that characterized everything the brothers did. On August 11th, Josiah traveled to town to offer their assistance to Dr. Morrison and to volunteer their services in caring for the sick. But his real purpose, which he revealed only to his brothers, was to place himself in direct contact with the disease, to invite it to test his faith and prove his worthiness as an instrument of divine will. Josiah's first stop was the home of Thomas Fletcher, the local blacksmith, whose 8-year-old son Timothy had fallen ill the previous night. The boy was burning with fever, his small body racked with convulsions that his parents were powerless to stop. When Josiah arrived, he found the Fletcher family gathered around Timothy's bed, praying desperately for divine intervention. What happened next would be remembered differently by everyone who witnessed it, but all agreed that Josiah's actions were both deeply moving and somehow disturbing. The youngest Blackwood brother knelt beside Timothy's bed and placed his hands on the boy's fever-hot forehead. But instead of offering a conventional prayer for the child's recovery, Josiah spoke words that would haunt everyone present. "Lord God," Josiah prayed, his voice carrying across the small bedroom with unusual resonance, "if this child must suffer for reasons known only to your divine wisdom, then let that suffering pass through me and my brothers. Let us bear what he cannot bear, experience what he should not experience, and become whatever we must become to serve your mysterious purposes. Take this innocent life and spare it through our willing sacrifice." As Josiah spoke, his hands seemed to grow warm against Timothy's forehead, and the boy's convulsions gradually subsided. The fever that had been consuming the child's small body began to break, and for the first time in hours, Timothy Fletcher opened his eyes and spoke in his normal voice, asking for water and complaining of hunger. The transformation was so dramatic and sudden that Thomas Fletcher fell to his knees, praising God for the miracle that had saved his son. But those who watched Josiah during those crucial minutes noticed changes that were far more subtle, but somehow more disturbing than Timothy's recovery. As the boy's fever broke, Josiah's own skin had taken on a flush that suggested his body temperature was rising. His eyes, normally the same pale blue that characterized all the Blackwood brothers, began to show flecks of gold that seemed to move and shift like liquid metal. When Josiah finally stood up from Timothy's bedside, he moved with the careful precision of a man who was fighting to maintain control over his own body. Dr. Morrison, who had been summoned to witness what the Fletchers were calling a miracle, examined both Timothy and Josiah with growing confusion and concern. The boy showed no trace of typhoid fever, but Josiah displayed early symptoms that were already progressing far more rapidly than should have been medically possible. Over the following 2 days, Josiah visited every household that had been touched by the epidemic, offering prayers and spiritual comfort to the bereaved families. At each stop, he repeated the same ritual, placing his hands on the heads of the sick and praying for their suffering to be transferred to himself and his brothers. The results were remarkable and terrifying in equal measure. In household after household, fever-stricken victims experienced sudden and complete recoveries. But with each healing, Josiah's own condition deteriorated more rapidly. By August 13th, when he finally returned to the Blackwood farm, Josiah was burning with fever and displaying symptoms that no medical textbook had ever described. But the most disturbing aspect was his continued insistence that everything was proceeding according to divine plan. Even as his fever climbed to temperatures that should have killed him, he spoke with perfect clarity about the sacred nature of his transformation. "This is not sickness," he told his increasingly concerned brothers. "This is purification. The Lord is burning away everything in me that is merely human, so that what remains will be worthy of the eternal work He has planned for us." Within hours, all 4 Blackwood brothers had begun displaying the same symptoms that had transformed Josiah. But their collective transformation would prove to be even more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Morrison's first examination of the Blackwood brothers on August 18th, 1878, would become the most significant and troubling case of his medical career. The August heat was oppressive as Dr. Morrison guided his horse cart up the winding dirt road that led to the Blackwood farm. The prairie grass on either side of the path had turned brown from weeks without rain, and the air shimmered with heat waves that made the distant farmhouse seem to float like a mirage. But as he approached the property, Morrison noticed details that struck him as oddly out of place. The brothers' wheat fields, which should have been suffering from the drought like every other farm in the county, stood tall and green as if they had been receiving regular rainfall. The cattle in the pastures appeared healthy and well-fed, despite the fact that grazing had become difficult throughout the region. When Morrison knocked on the farmhouse door, it was opened by Ezra. But the eldest brother's appearance immediately struck the doctor as profoundly wrong. Ezra's skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed the network of blood vessels beneath. But the blood that flowed through those vessels was not the normal red of human circulation. Instead, it possessed a golden luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. "Dr. Morrison," Ezra said, and his voice carried the authority Morrison remembered, but it was amplified and enriched with harmonic overtones that made every word seem to resonate directly in the listener's chest cavity. "We have been expecting you. Our transformation is nearly complete, and we require your witness to ensure that others will understand what has occurred here." Morrison found the four brothers arranged in the main room of the farmhouse, their bodies positioned with mathematical precision that suggested careful planning rather than random placement. They were alive. Their chests rose and fell with breathing, their eyes tracked Morrison's movement, but they had been transformed in ways that challenged his understanding of human physiology. "Their vital signs are impossible," Morrison wrote in his private journal that night. Ezra's temperature registered 107 degrees, yet he sits upright and speaks with perfect clarity. "Caleb's pulse is so slow I can barely detect it, yet he moves with normal energy. Josiah's breathing has changed. He seems to inhale and exhale only once every few minutes, but shows no signs of oxygen deprivation. And Abel's skin temperature is actually lower than normal, despite his obvious fever symptoms. Caleb, positioned to Ezra's right, had undergone changes that were equally dramatic but different in their specific manifestation. The characteristic rose-colored spots of typhoid fever covered his entire body, but instead of the random pattern typical of the disease, they had arranged themselves into complex geometric designs that resembled mathematical equations written in flesh and blood. As Morrison watched in fascination and horror, the pattern slowly shifted and changed, as if Caleb's skin had become a living blackboard. "The calculations are becoming clear," Caleb said, his voice joining Ezra's in perfect harmony, despite the fact that they were speaking simultaneously. "The relationship between matter and spirit, between time and eternity, between human limitation and divine potential. We are becoming the proof of theorems that human mathematics has only begun to glimpse." Josiah's transformation had progressed along lines that reflected his scholarly nature and deep theological knowledge. His body remained recognizably human in its basic structure, but his skin had taken on the appearance of ancient parchment, covered with writing in scripts that Morrison recognized as Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, along with other symbols that seemed to shift and change even as he watched. When Josiah spoke, his words came in a voice that no longer sounded entirely human. The sound seemed to originate from multiple points around the room simultaneously, creating an effect that made Morrison feel as if he were being addressed by a choir of invisible speakers. "Doctor, we have discovered truths that your medical science cannot accommodate. We are documenting these revelations so that future generations might understand the process of divine transformation." Abel, the youngest brother, had undergone the most visually striking transformation of all. His entire body emanated a soft phosphorescent glow that provided illumination for the room's interior. The light was not harsh or unpleasant, but it was profoundly unnatural. A cool, blue-white radiance that seemed to come from within his very bones. His eyes had become completely luminous, lacking pupils or irises, appearing instead as twin stars set in a human face. "We no longer require food as sustenance," Abel said, his words somehow reaching Morrison's ears from both inside the room and from what seemed like a great distance. "We draw our energy directly from sources that human science has not yet discovered. We are becoming something new, something that exists between the mortal and eternal realms." Morrison's attempts to document his findings were met with resistance from the brothers themselves. They claimed that their condition was a divine gift, a sign that God had chosen them for a special purpose. They spoke of being refined by holy fire and transformed into vessels worthy of the Lord's work. But Dr. Morrison's medical training told him something far different. The brothers' symptoms resembled no known disease, and their collective transformation suggested either mass hysteria or something more sinister. He began to suspect that they had been exposed to some unknown toxin, possibly from their well water or from contaminated grain in their silo. The community's reaction to the brothers' condition was mixed and increasingly tense. Some residents, led by Reverend Marcus Thorne of the Methodist Church, viewed their survival as miraculous. They began making pilgrimages to the Blackwood farm, hoping to witness divine intervention firsthand. Others, particularly those who had lost family members to the epidemic, found the brothers' transformation disturbing and unnatural. "It ain't right," muttered Jacob Steinberg, who had buried his wife and 2 children in the space of a week. "Why should they be spared when good Christian folk are dying? And look at them. That ain't no blessing I can see. There's something wrong with those boys, something that makes my skin crawl just looking at them." The brothers' behavior during this period only intensified the community's unease. They continued to work their fields despite their condition, moving with an eerie coordination that suggested they were communicating without words. Neighbors reported seeing them standing motionless in their wheat fields for hours at a time, their faces turned toward the sky as if listening to some inaudible voice. The changes in their chapel services became particularly unsettling. The brothers had always conducted their worship privately, but now their voices could be heard across the prairie during their evening prayers. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, yet profoundly wrong. 4 voices harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords should not have been able to produce. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who lived on the neighboring farm, later told Dr. Morrison that she had approached the chapel one evening to investigate the strange music. "I got within 50 yards of that building," she said, "and I swear on my mother's grave that I could feel something pushing me back. Not physically, you understand, but something inside my head telling me to turn around and leave. Those boys are changed, Doctor. Changed in ways that ain't natural." As August turned to September, the typhoid epidemic began to wane in Cedar Ridge. The contaminated well had been sealed, new water sources established, and the surviving residents slowly returned to their normal routines. But the mystery of the Blackwood brothers deepened with each passing day. Dr. Morrison made weekly visits to the farm, ostensibly to monitor the brothers' condition, but actually to document the progression of their transformation. What he observed challenged his understanding of human physiology and left him questioning his own sanity. Ezra's internal temperature had stabilized at 106.7 degrees Fahrenheit, yet he showed no signs of brain damage or organ failure. His eyes had developed a golden hue that seemed to shift and swirl like liquid metal. When he spoke, his words carried a weight and authority that made listeners feel compelled to agree with him, even when he said things that defied logic. "Dr. Morrison," Ezra said during one examination, "you are attempting to measure us using instruments designed for ordinary human physiology. We have moved beyond the limitations that such tools were created to assess. Our bodies now function according to principles that your medical science has not yet discovered." Caleb's rose-colored spots had continued to evolve, forming increasingly complex patterns that resembled ancient scripts. Dr. Morrison consulted several scholars by correspondence, sending careful drawings of the markings, but none could identify the symbols. More disturbing still, the patterns seemed to move slowly across Caleb's skin, rearranging themselves into new configurations every few days. When Morrison attempted to take a blood sample from Caleb's arm, he discovered that the brother's blood had been transformed into something that barely resembled normal human circulation. The substance that flowed from the small puncture wound was thicker than blood, golden in color, and seemed to move with deliberate purpose rather than responding to gravity and pressure. "Our circulation has been redesigned," Caleb explained, watching Morrison's growing confusion with what might have been amusement. "The fluid that sustains us now carries not just oxygen and nutrients, but information and energy from sources that transcend physical matter." Josiah's voice had become completely inhuman. When he spoke, the sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very air around him was vibrating with his words. Dr. Morrison noted that conversations with Josiah left him feeling dizzy and disoriented, and he began to suspect that the brother's speech was somehow affecting his brain chemistry. The texts that covered Josiah's skin were not static decorations, but were actively being written by some invisible force. As Morrison watched, new words appeared along Josiah's arms and chest, forming sentences and paragraphs in real time. The content seemed to be a running commentary on Morrison's examination, describing his thoughts and reactions with accuracy that suggested the brother could read his mind. "We are becoming books," Josiah said, his multi-directional voice making Morrison's head spin with vertigo. "Living repositories of knowledge that spans both human learning and divine revelation. The transformation is encoding information directly into our physical substance." Abel's phosphorescence had grown stronger, allowing him to illuminate entire rooms, with the pale glow emanating from his skin. But more unsettling was his apparent ability to sense things that should have been beyond human perception. He could predict weather changes days in advance, locate lost objects without searching, and seemed to know when visitors were approaching the farm long before they became visible. During one examination, Abel demonstrated an ability to perceive things that should have been beyond human sensation. He correctly identified the contents of Morrison's medical bag without looking inside it, described in detail the condition of horses stabled half a mile away, and seemed to be aware of conversations taking place in the town of Cedar Ridge, 3 miles distant. "Our senses have been opened to perceive realities that normal humans cannot detect," Abel explained, his luminous eyes somehow managing to convey warmth despite their otherworldly appearance. "We can see across distances that should be impossible, hear sounds that carry on frequencies beyond normal hearing." The brothers' collective behavior had also changed in ways that suggested they were becoming something more than human. They moved with perfect synchronization, finishing each other's sentences and responding to unspoken communications. Their need for food and sleep had diminished dramatically. Dr. Morrison observed that they consumed perhaps half the calories of normal men and seemed to require only 2 or 3 hours of rest each night. Most disturbing of all was their claim that they were receiving divine revelations. The brothers spoke of visions showing them the future of their community, prophecies about coming disasters, and instructions for preparing their neighbors for some unnamed catastrophe. They began writing these revelations in a leather-bound journal, using a script that resembled no known language. The community's initial curiosity about the brothers' condition gradually gave way to fear and suspicion. Children were forbidden from playing near the Blackwood property, and adults crossed themselves when they saw the brothers in town. The Methodist Church, which had initially celebrated their survival as a miracle, began to distance itself from the family. Reverend Thorne, who had once praised the brothers' faith, now spoke of them with barely concealed unease. "I fear," he confided to Dr. Morrison, "that in their zeal to serve the Lord, they may have opened themselves to influences that are not entirely heavenly. There is something in their eyes now, something that looks back at you with knowledge that no mortal man should possess." By October 1878, the situation at the Blackwood farm had become untenable. The brothers' transformation had progressed to the point where they could no longer be considered entirely human, yet they remained lucid and articulate about their condition. They spoke of being purified vessels, chosen by God to serve as intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms. Dr. Morrison's documentation of their condition had become increasingly frantic. His journal entries revealed a man struggling to maintain his scientific rationalism in the face of phenomena that defied explanation. He had begun corresponding with medical colleagues in Kansas City and Chicago, seeking advice on the case, but their responses only deepened his frustration. "No physician I've consulted has ever encountered anything resembling the Blackwood brothers' condition," he wrote. "Their symptoms are physiologically impossible, yet I observe them with my own eyes. I begin to wonder if I am losing my mind, or if there are aspects of human biology that our medical science has yet to discover." The breaking point came on October 15th, when young Sarah Preston, the daughter of a local farmer, disappeared while playing near the Blackwood property. Her parents found her 3 hours later, sitting in the brothers' chapel with a serene expression on her face. She claimed that the brothers had told her wonderful secrets about heaven and had shown her visions of angels. But when Dr. Morrison examined the child, he found that her temperature had risen to 103 degrees, and her eyes had begun to take on the same golden hue that characterized Ezra's condition. The girl's parents, terrified that their daughter had been infected with whatever had changed the brothers, demanded that Dr. Morrison intervene. "You have to stop this," Sarah's father, Thomas Preston, pleaded. "Those men, or whatever they've become, they're spreading their curse to our children. My little girl keeps talking about joining them in their holy work. She says they've shown her things that no 7-year-old should know about." Dr. Morrison's examination of Sarah revealed that she had indeed been affected by her contact with the brothers. Her fever was unlike typhoid or any other disease he recognized, and her behavior had changed dramatically. She spoke with wisdom beyond her years, demonstrated knowledge of medical and theological concepts she couldn't possibly have learned, and seemed to glow with the same phosphorescence that characterized Abel. Faced with the possibility that the brother's condition might be contagious, Dr. Morrison made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He contacted the Kansas State Medical Board and the Regional Health Authority, requesting immediate intervention. But when officials arrived to investigate, they found the case so disturbing that they chose to suppress it rather than study it. Dr. James Patterson, the state medical examiner, spent 3 days at the Blackwood farm in late October. His official report, sealed by the state board, allegedly contained observations that were incompatible with current medical understanding and potentially damaging to public health and safety. The report was classified and remains sealed to this day. But Patterson's private letters to his wife, discovered years later, revealed the true extent of his horror. "I have seen things," he wrote, "that challenge not only our understanding of disease and human physiology, but the very nature of life itself. The Blackwood brothers are no longer entirely human, yet they are not dead. They exist in some intermediate state that our science cannot explain and dare not acknowledge." The community's growing unease about the brothers' continued presence came to a head when several families reported that their children had begun disappearing from their beds at night, only to be found hours later, standing in the fields surrounding the Blackwood chapel. The children had no memory of how they had gotten there, but they returned with knowledge and abilities that their parents found deeply disturbing. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Cedar Ridge intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. Mayor William Harrison convened a town meeting on October 25th to address what many residents viewed as a crisis requiring immediate intervention. The meeting was attended by nearly every adult in Cedar Ridge, and the discussions revealed a community deeply divided between those who viewed the brothers as blessed healers and those who saw them as dangerous influences. Dr. Morrison was called upon to provide a medical assessment, but his testimony only deepened the community's confusion and fear. He described the brothers' condition as unlike anything in medical literature, acknowledged that their influence appeared to be spreading to other residents, and admitted that conventional medicine had no treatment to offer. "I have observed physiological changes in the Blackwood brothers that challenge our fundamental understanding of human biology," Morrison told the assembled crowd. "Their vital signs are consistently abnormal, yet they show no signs of illness. Their capabilities exceed normal human limitations, yet they maintain lucid consciousness. I cannot classify their condition as a disease because they are not suffering. I cannot call it an improvement because it represents a fundamental alteration of human nature." The meeting concluded with a decision that would have profound consequences. A committee of community leaders was formed to visit the Blackwood farm and demand that the brothers either reverse the changes they had undergone or leave Cedar Ridge permanently. The committee would include Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, Thomas Preston, and Dr. Morrison, and they would deliver an ultimatum requiring the brothers to respond within 1 week. The delegation from Cedar Ridge arrived at the Blackwood farm on November 1st, 1878, under a grey sky that seemed to press down upon the prairie with the weight of impending winter. Dr. Morrison rode alongside Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, and Thomas Preston, each man lost in his own thoughts about the confrontation that awaited them. The farmhouse and outbuildings appeared normal from a distance, but as the delegation drew closer, details emerged that confirmed Morrison's growing conviction that the Blackwood property had become something beyond conventional classification. The wheat fields, which should have been harvested weeks earlier, stood tall and golden despite the approaching winter. The cattle in the pastures moved with an unnatural coordination, grazing in precise patterns that formed geometric shapes when viewed from the elevation of the road. Most unsettling of all was the chapel on the hill. The limestone structure seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence that was visible even in daylight, and the sound of voices could be heard emanating from within. Not the familiar harmonies of Methodist hymns, but something far more complex and otherworldly. When the delegation knocked on the farmhouse door, it was opened by young Sarah Preston, whose presence there shocked her father into momentary speechlessness. The girl appeared healthy and happy, but the golden flecks in her eyes had grown more pronounced, and her skin had developed the same translucent quality that characterized the brothers' condition. "Hello, Papa," Sarah said, her voice carrying the harmonic undertones that had become the signature of the transformation. "The brothers have been expecting you. They're waiting in the chapel, and they're ready to answer all your questions." The delegation's journey to the chapel was marked by phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality itself. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate with subtle energy, and the air around them shimmered with patterns of light that resembled heat waves but felt cool to the touch. Birds flew in formations that defied their natural behavior, arranging themselves in geometric patterns that shifted and changed as the men walked toward the hill. When they entered the chapel, they found the 4 Blackwood brothers arranged in a perfect square around the altar, their bodies positioned with mathematical precision. The brothers' transformation had reached a stage that made their previous condition seem almost normal by comparison. Their skin had become completely translucent, revealing internal structures that bore no resemblance to normal human anatomy. Their eyes were pools of liquid gold that seemed to contain depths beyond physical possibility. "Welcome," said Ezra, though his voice seemed to come from all 4 brothers simultaneously. "We have been expecting you, and we understand the concerns that have brought you here. You fear what we have become, and you worry about the effects our transformation is having on your community. These are reasonable fears, and we do not dismiss them lightly." Mayor Harrison, speaking as the official representative of Cedar Ridge, delivered the ultimatum that the town had decided upon. The brothers would need to either return to their normal human condition or leave the area permanently. The community could no longer tolerate the uncertainty and fear that their presence had created. "Mr. Mayor," responded Caleb, his voice joining Ezra's in perfect harmony, "we understand your position, but we must tell you that what you ask is impossible. The transformation we have undergone cannot be reversed, any more than a butterfly can return to being a caterpillar. We have moved beyond the boundaries of human existence, and there is no path that leads backward from where we now stand." Reverend Thorne attempted to address the spiritual dimensions of the brothers' condition, arguing that their transformation represented a departure from God's intended design for human nature. He quoted biblical passages about the sanctity of the human form and the dangers of seeking knowledge beyond what God had granted to mankind. But the brothers' response challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between divine will and human limitation. Josiah, speaking with a voice that seemed to echo from multiple dimensions simultaneously, argued that their transformation represented the fulfillment of humanity's spiritual potential. "Reverend Thorne," Josiah said, his words accompanied by patterns of light that danced across the chapel walls, You speak of God's design as if it were static and unchanging. But the scriptures themselves promise that human beings are destined for transformation and elevation. We have simply discovered the path that leads to that promised transformation. Dr. Morrison attempted to address the medical aspects of the brothers' condition, arguing that their influence on other community members represented a public health threat. But the brothers' response revealed the limitations of approaching their condition through conventional medical frameworks. "Dr. Morrison," said Abel, his luminous form casting shifting patterns of light throughout the chapel, "you have documented our transformation with admirable scientific precision, but you continue to evaluate us using criteria designed for ordinary human physiology. We are no longer bound by the limitations that those criteria were created to measure." The turning point in the confrontation came when Thomas Preston confronted the brothers about their influence on his daughter. His parental desperation broke through the philosophical abstractions that had dominated the discussion. "I don't care about your theories and theology," Preston said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I care about my little girl. She was normal and happy before you got your hands on her. Now she talks like an adult, knows things no child should know, and looks at me with eyes that seem to see right through to my soul. I want my daughter back the way she was." The brothers' response revealed both their compassion and the irreversible nature of the changes they had initiated. They explained that Sarah's transformation had begun not when she visited their chapel, but when Josiah had prayed over Timothy Fletcher months earlier. That prayer had opened a connection that could not be severed. "Thomas," said Ezra, his voice carrying infinite gentleness, "your daughter is not lost to you. She is becoming something that will serve purposes far greater than anything she could achieve within the limitations of ordinary human existence. The love you feel for her will continue to bind you together, even as she evolves beyond normal human classification." But it was Sarah herself who provided the resolution that none of the adults had been able to achieve. She stepped forward and addressed the delegation with clarity that seemed impossible for someone her age. "Papa, Mayor Harrison, Reverend Thorne, Dr. Morrison," she said, her young voice carrying absolute truth. "You're asking the wrong questions. You want to know if what's happening to us is good or bad, safe or dangerous, right or wrong. But those categories don't apply to what we're becoming. We're not better or worse than we were before. We're different in ways that make such comparisons meaningless." The brothers then offered to demonstrate their capabilities, to prove that their transformation represented expansion rather than loss. Dr. Morrison, driven by scientific curiosity despite his fear, agreed to the demonstration. What followed provided Morrison with evidence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The brothers arranged themselves around the delegation and began what they called a consciousness bridge, a process that allowed normal humans to experience temporarily the expanded awareness that had become their permanent condition. For several minutes that seemed to last hours, Morrison experienced reality from the brothers' perspective. He could perceive the thoughts and emotions of every person in Cedar Ridge, witness events occurring hundreds of miles away, and understand connections between apparently unrelated phenomena that revealed the underlying unity of all existence. The experience was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying, offering knowledge that no human mind was designed to contain. When the demonstration ended, Morrison found himself changed in ways that would affect him for the rest of his life. He had experienced proof that reality was far more complex than conventional science acknowledged, but he had also discovered that some knowledge was too vast for ordinary human consciousness to process safely. The other members of the delegation had similar experiences, but the demonstration also revealed the price that came with such expansion. Each member experienced moments of disorientation as their normal consciousness struggled to process information that exceeded its capacity. The truth about the Blackwood brothers was finally revealed through Dr. Morrison's secret analysis of their blood samples. Under his microscope, instead of normal cells, he found structures that defied classification. Larger than normal, possessing multiple nuclei and moving with deliberate purpose. "The blood is alive," Morrison wrote, his handwriting betraying agitation, not merely containing life, but possessing consciousness that coordinates cellular activities. It's as if their entire circulatory system has become a single thinking organism. Morrison discovered the brothers hadn't survived typhoid fever. They had been transformed by it. The disease had triggered some form of evolutionary adaptation, changing their fundamental biology. Their bodies had become something new, existing between life and death. The brothers revealed that their transformation had been intentional from the beginning. Josiah's prayer over Timothy Fletcher had been a calculated ritual based on knowledge discovered in theological studies. They had found references to divine communion, requiring complete surrender of human flesh to achieve union with the eternal. "We are not dying," Caleb said. "We are becoming. This flesh is merely a cocoon, and we are emerging as something far greater." The brothers revealed contact with others like themselves throughout history, individuals who had undergone similar transformations. They spoke of a network of purified vessels, working to prepare humanity for some great change. Morrison realized the brothers had become something beyond human classification, not alive in traditional sense, but not dead either. They existed in a state medical science could not acknowledge because it challenged fundamental assumptions about life and death. "You can join us," Abel said, his phosphorescent skin pulsing with invitation. "Your scientific mind would be preserved and enhanced." But Morrison, faced with the choice between humanity and transcendence, chose to remain human. He fled the chapel, driving through darkness with desperation, born of absolute terror. Dr. Morrison's flight from Cedar Ridge marked the beginning of the end for the Blackwood brothers' story. Unable to cope with what he had witnessed, Morrison destroyed all his research, burned his journals, and left Kansas forever. He settled in Oregon, where he practiced medicine for another 30 years, but he never spoke of the Blackwood case to anyone. The brothers themselves seemed to understand that their presence had become incompatible with the human community they had once served. In the weeks following Morrison's departure, they began to withdraw from all contact with their neighbors. The lights in their chapel, which had been visible across the prairie for months, went dark. The strange harmonies that had echoed from their evening prayers fell silent. On December 15, 1878, Thomas Preston found the first body. Ezra lay in the chapel, his transformed flesh already beginning to decompose in ways that followed no known biological process. His golden eyes had turned to glass, and his skin had taken on the appearance of ancient parchment. There was no obvious cause of death. He had simply ceased to exist. The other brothers were found over the following days, each in a different location on the farm. Caleb was discovered in the wheat fields, his body surrounded by a circle of grain that had grown to impossible heights overnight. Josiah was found in the farmhouse library, seated at his desk with a pen in his hand and a blank page before him. Abel was discovered in the barn, his phosphorescent skin still glowing faintly in the darkness. The Methodist Church, eager to distance itself from the case, arranged for the brothers to be buried quickly and quietly in the chapel's small cemetery. No autopsy was performed, no official cause of death was recorded, and the graves were marked with simple stones bearing only names and dates. But the mystery of the Blackwood brothers did not end with their deaths. In the years that followed, the farm was abandoned, and the chapel fell into ruin. Yet travelers passing through the area reported strange lights emanating from the hilltop, and the sound of harmonious voices carrying across the prairie on still nights. The Kansas State Medical Board's sealed report on the case remains classified to this day. Dr. Patterson's recommendation that the matter be permanently suppressed in the interests of public health and scientific integrity was accepted without question. The official position is that the Blackwood brothers died of typhoid fever complications, and that any reports of unusual symptoms were the result of mass hysteria brought on by the epidemic. In 1923, the abandoned Blackwood farm was purchased by a development company that intended to build a new town on the site. but construction workers refused to work near the chapel ruins, reporting feelings of overwhelming dread and strange visions. The project was abandoned, and the land was eventually donated to the state as a wildlife preserve. The preserve remains closed to the public, officially due to environmental concerns, but local residents know the real reason. The Blackwood brothers' transformation may have ended with their deaths, but the questions they raised about the nature of human existence, the boundaries between life and death, and the possibility of transcendence through surrender of self continue to haunt those who know the full story. Modern science still refuses to acknowledge the Blackwood case, not because the evidence is lacking, but because the implications are too disturbing to contemplate. If the brothers' transformation was real, if they truly became something beyond human classification, then our understanding of biology, consciousness, and the nature of existence itself must be fundamentally reconsidered. The truth is that some mysteries are too dangerous to solve, some knowledge too terrible to possess. The Blackwood brothers discovered a path to transcendence that required the complete surrender of their humanity, and in doing so, they became something that human society could neither understand nor accept. Their story serves as a warning about the dangers of seeking knowledge that humanity is not prepared to handle. In their desire to commune directly with the divine, to bypass the limitations of human existence, they opened themselves to forces that transformed them into something that was neither fully alive nor completely dead. The chapel on the hilltop stands empty now, its windows dark and its doors sealed. But on certain nights, when the wind is still and the moon is dark, travelers report seeing 4 figures standing in the wheat fields, their faces turned toward the sky as if listening to some distant voice. What we do know is that the Blackwood brothers' quest for divine communion led them to a destination that science cannot map and religion cannot explain. They became living proof that there are some thresholds that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed, and some transformations that are irreversible. This mystery shows us that the boundaries between life and death, between human and divine, may be far more permeable than we imagine. The Blackwood brothers found a way to transcend those boundaries, but the price they paid was their humanity itself. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below and share your theories about what really happened to the 4 brothers. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The truth is out there, waiting for those brave enough to seek it. See you in the next video.